Chapter 11. Self-culture, facilities and difficulties. Every person has two educations, one which he receives from others, and one, more important, which he gives to himself. Gibbon. Is there one whom difficulties dishearten, who bends to the storm? He will do little. Is there one who will conquer? That kind of man never fails. John Hunter. The wise and active conquer difficulties, by daring to attempt them. Sloth and folly shiver and shrink at sight of toil and danger, and make the impossibility they fear. Rowe. The best part of every man's education, said Sir Walter Scott, is that which he gives to himself. The late Sir Benjamin Brodie delighted to remember this saying, and he used to congratulate himself on the fact that professionally he was self-taught. But this is necessarily the case with all men who have acquired distinction in letters, science, or art. The education received at school or college is but a beginning, and is valuable mainly inasmuch as it trains the mind and habituates it to continuous application and study. That which is put into us by others is always far less ours than that which we acquire by our own diligent and persevering effort. Knowledge conquered by labor becomes a possession, a property entirely our own. A greater vividness and permanency of impression is secured, and facts thus acquired become registered in the mind in a way that mere imparted information can never effect. This kind of self-culture also calls forth power and cultivates strength. The solution of one problem helps the mastery of another, and thus knowledge is carried into faculty. Our own active effort is the essential thing. And no facilities, no books, no teachers, no amount of lessons learned by rote will enable us to dispense with it. The best teachers have been the readiest to recognize the importance of self-culture, and of stimulating the student to acquire knowledge by the active exercise of his own faculties. They have relied more upon training than upon telling, and sought to make their pupils themselves active parties to the work in which they were engaged, thus making teaching something far higher than the mere passive reception of the scraps and details of knowledge. This was the spirit in which the great Dr. Arnold worked. He strove to teach his pupils to rely upon themselves, and develop their powers by their own active efforts, himself merely guiding, directing, stimulating, and encouraging them. I would far rather, he said, send a boy to Van Diemen's Land, where he must work for his bread, than send him to Oxford to live in luxury, without any desire in his mind to avail himself of his advantages. If there be one thing on earth, he observed on another occasion, which is truly admirable, it is to see God's wisdom blessing an inferiority of natural powers, when they have been honestly, truly, and zealously cultivated. Speaking of a pupil of this character, he said, I would stand to that man hat in hand. Once at Laleham, when teaching a rather dull boy, Arnold spoke somewhat sharply to him, on which the pupil looked up in his face and said, Why do you speak angrily, sir? Indeed, I am doing the best I can. Years afterwards, Arnold used to tell the story to his children, and added, I never felt so much in my life. That look and that speech I have never forgotten. From the numerous instances already cited of men of humble station who have risen to distinction in science and literature, it will be obvious that labor is by no means incompatible with the highest intellectual culture. Work in moderation is healthy, as well as agreeable to the human constitution. Work educates the body, as study educates the mind. And that is the best state of society in which there is some work for every man's leisure, and some leisure for every man's work. Even the leisure classes are in a measure compelled to work, sometimes as a relief from ennui, but in most cases to gratify an instinct which they cannot resist. Some go fox hunting in the English counties, others grouse shooting on the Scotch hills, while many wander away every summer to climb mountains in Switzerland. Hence the boating, running, cricketing, and athletic sports of the public schools, in which our young men at the same time so healthfully cultivate their strength both of mind and body. It is said that the Duke of Wellington, when once looking on at the boys engaged in their sports in the playground at Eton, where he had spent many of his own younger days, made the remark, "It was there that the Battle of Waterloo was won." Daniel Malthus urged his son when in college to be most diligent in the cultivation of knowledge, but he also enjoined him to pursue manly sports as the best means of keeping up the full working power of his mind, as well as of enjoying the pleasures of intellect. "Every kind of knowledge," said he, "every acquaintance with nature and art, will amuse and strengthen your mind, and I am perfectly pleased that cricket should do the same by your arms and legs. I love to see you excel in exercises of the body, and I think myself that the better half, and much the most agreeable part, of the pleasures of the mind is best enjoyed while one is upon one's legs." But a still more important use of active employment is that referred to by the great divine, Jeremy Taylor. "Avoid idleness," he says, "and fill up all the spaces of thy time with severe and useful employment. For lust easily creeps in at those emptinesses where the soul is unemployed and the body is at ease. For no easy, healthful, idle person was ever chaste if he could be tempted. But of all employments bodily labor is the most useful, and of the greatest benefit for driving away the devil." Practical success in life depends more upon physical health than is generally imagined. Hodgson, of Hodgson's Horse, writing home to a friend in England, said, "I believe, if I get on well in India, it will be owing, physically speaking, to a sound digestion." The capacity for continuous working in any calling must necessarily depend in a great measure upon this. And hence the necessity for attending to health, even as a means of intellectual labor. It is perhaps to the neglect of physical exercise that we find among students so frequent a tendency towards discontent, unhappiness, inaction, and reverie, displaying itself in contempt for real life and disgust at the beaten tracks of men, a tendency which in England has been called Byronism, and in Germany Wertherism. Dr. Channing noted the same growth in America, which led him to make the remark, that too many of our young men grow up in a school of despair. The only remedy for this green sickness in youth is physical exercise, action, work, and bodily occupation. The use of early labor in self-imposed mechanical employments may be illustrated by the boyhood of Sir Isaac Newton. Though a comparatively dull scholar, he was very assiduous in the use of his saw, hammer, and hatchet, knocking and hammering in his lodging room, making models of windmills, carriages, and machines of all sorts. And as he grew older, he took delight in making little tables and cupboards for his friends. Smeaton, Watt, and Stevenson were equally handy with tools when mere boys. And but for such kind of self-culture in their youth, it is doubtful whether they would have accomplished so much in their manhood. Such was also the early training of the great inventors and mechanics described in the preceding pages, whose contrivance and intelligence were practically trained by the constant use of their hands in early life. Even where men belonging to the manual labor class have risen above it, and become more purely intellectual laborers, they have found the advantages of their early training in their later pursuits. Elihu Burritt says he found hard labor necessary to enable him to study with effect. And more than once he gave up school teaching and study, and, taking to his leather apron again, went back to his blacksmith's forge and anvil for his health of body and mind's sake.